Everyone. I'm Will, and this is the Effects podcast, where today we'll be talking about the golden age of radio, specifically radio dramas, and how these dramas develop the sound effects used today to help tell our stories. Before we get to radio, though, we have to talk about movies, because Foley artists and many of the techniques they used came from developments that happened with film. If you don't know what a Foley artist is, they are the ones who create all the sounds and match them to what's happening as it's happening. In order to make the sounds realistic or help impossible things feel real, Foley artists have to use a variety of objects and motions to produce the believable soundscape. But you'll hear more on that later. So, in 1925, the Vitaphone was invented, which allowed sound to be recorded on a disc, like a record, then played back in sync with the movie, creating the illusion that the pictures were talking. The first film to put this method into use was 1927's The Jazz Singer, and overnight, the industry changed. Everyone was in a frenzy to get the equipment needed and convert their silent films, but no one had the personnel, and that is where Jack Foley steps in, whom the term is named after. In the mad rush to, quote, start breaking men in for sound procedure, end quote, studios hired anyone who had any kind of understanding of radio or anyone who was willing to try. Jack was one of those who stepped up. Before this, Jack was a screenwriter and assistant director in charge of shooting inserts, which are quick close-up shots of like an object or a person. And through this job, he learned a lot of skills, including being resourceful, which came in handy when the sound engineers on the 1929 musical Showboat were having trouble syncing music and sound effects at the same time due to the limitations of technology at the time. Jack suggested that while the film played on a screen, the orchestra played at the same time as the artists produced their sounds in real time, syncing everything to the actions on the film. This was the first Foley session, and Foley artistry was born. Jack would continue on innovating what was possible with Foley in the movie industry, but his methods would transcend into other media, including radio dramas of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, where Foley artists had to perform the sounds with actors live. Tyler here has got more on that.
Yeah, thanks, Will. So next I'm going to show you a video that I think really perfectly illustrates how these sound effects were created during the golden age of radio. So we'll cue the video up now.
Meanwhile, Betty, frantic at her uncle's danger, has undone her bonds and is starting for help in the crippled car.
Sheriff Tom, hurry, hurry.
Betty, where's your Uncle Pete?
We were held up, Tom. 3 men. They took the Flying B payroll and headed up toward Pine Gap, and they took Uncle with them.
Come on to the house quick. We'll get the boys together and we'll go after them.
No, I'll take the jitney into town and get my car.
All right, Betty.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about this video and how cool it was. It gives a really good kind of backstory and behind the scenes look into how these were created. So as we can see early in the video, a young boy is listening to a Western radio drama, and then it cuts to showing actors acting out how he imagines the show. And then after that, it goes to the recording studio where the cast are actually creating all of the sounds that he's hearing using everyday items such as a Kleenex box, dishes, fans, etc. The announcers hold scripts and recite lines as the story goes on. They're not fabricated, but they're actually created in real time. Even the sounds of someone far away from the other characters are created by the announcers moving further from the microphone to deceive the ears of the listeners. The video is 9 minutes, so I didn't show the whole thing, but this is just a gist of what it is like. The sound of dishes being washed, doors closing, and the music being played are all created in real time with props and crew members. The sounds of animals are created by machines that are turned by hands to create the sound of horses neighing and chickens clucking. Horses' movements are heard, and then we are shown young men beating fabric balls with added sticks on their chest to create such a noise. The sound of wagons moving is created by a toy wagon being slid across rocks below a microphone. Even the voice of a child is fabricated, as we see an adult man come to the microphone to play the part. Sounds of thunder and wind are created in large metal pieces, and the sounds of the characters running are created by the announcers themselves running into the room. In this short video, we are shown just how much attention to detail had to go into creating sound effects for radio shows in this age in history. Without modern technology, sound effects had to be created in real life by actors and crew members using a variety of methods to create the sounds heard by their audience. The way the sound effects were made back then was really cool, and I want to pass it off to Elizabeth to dive more into the effects of the time.
Thanks, Tyler. Yeah. So as the industry developed, particularly later on, a lot of these effects could be used by playing pre-recorded sounds from records, especially things that were harder for humans to replicate, for example, animal sounds. But for particularly simpler things were often cheaper and easier and better done by experts in the studio. For example, something like knocking on a door is a lot easier to control when you're doing it yourself than when you're pulling it from a record. You can make the whole difference between something like this or as opposed to having to manipulate one specific sound that you have. A lot of the simpler sounds using kind of methods that you wouldn't necessarily think of. And I found a bunch of them really interesting. For example, the sound of like footsteps in snow, which is something that we get a lot of, could be made by squeezing or pushing on cornstarch to make that crunching sound. Some of them are a little bit, more simple, more come quick to the mind. For example, blowing through a straw into water to make the sound of bubbling or boiling water. Horror and mystery shows were really popular at this time, and they could make sounds of someone being stabbed by stabbing a knife into a head of cabbage or a melon. And so it makes something that's really gory and scary, but super simple to produce in the studio. And then for a lot of things, they also did have to create specific devices. So they would make these objects that were specifically made to create one specific sound. And one of the most interesting ones I thought about, that I learned about, was this wind machine to make the sound of whooshing wind for like sandstorms or storms, or they used it a lot on the Superman show for flying. And it's made using wrapping canvas or cloth around a rotating dowel so that it rubs against some wood, which is not the easiest thing to understand when I say it. So I actually also have a video of that I can show you guys so you can understand what I mean. Maybe just a second. So yeah, there were a lot of really interesting ways that they could create these sounds in a studio and create devices like that so that it was even easier for them. They wouldn't even have to think about manipulating it. They just had it on hand. And they use these, create that story, but also they could be useful for other purposes, which Tiffany's going to go into for you guys.
Yes, so sound effects were not only made to be interesting and draw the viewers in, but to also advertise for major companies back then. Since the radio just started to arise and everyone was so fascinated in listening, companies took advantage of making viewers want to buy their products. Back of the Mic, the video that Tyler gave us a preview of, created in 1938, was a short radio skit that was produced by Chevrolet just to advertise their cars. This 9-minute radio show that was also filmed used a distinct sound of a Chevy's engine to attract the listeners into buying their cars. The roar of their engine resonated with many, which also made it impossible for them to resist. After hearing that engine, viewers would know exactly what kind of car would be coming down the road just by that sound. In the 1930s, Coca-Cola aired their first radio show called The Coca-Cola Hour, which aired on NBC. The show helped Coca-Cola sell and advertise their products by adding music and a jingle. The Coca-Cola signature is what the jingle was called. Signature implied that it was well known for the brand. The sound of the glass Coke bottle opening and clicking, the viewers instantly knew exactly what kind of brand soda it was. By this point in time, people were very familiar with the radio and the different tricks that you could use to produce on air. Sound effects played a crucial role in advertising back then, but because everything wasn't so visual, it gave that effect. This gave them a chance to feel exactly what was going on without physically being there, which Andrew can explain more about.
Thank you, Tiffany. So one of the effects of sound effects, specifically in radio, was that it was designed to convey a message across. It was designed specifically to tell you what is happening, even though you cannot physically be there for it. And one of the most famous sound effects of all time is canned laughter. And I'm going to go explore a little bit into depth because that kind of relays a lot of the reasons why people have been so fanatic about sound effects. And there are two main creators of canned laughter. The first one is Jack Mullen, who in 1946 created the first ever laughing recording. He was one of the sound people for Bing Crosby's radio show, and he was doing an interview with the hillbilly comedian Bob Burns. Bob was telling a story, and the audience was in stitches and laughing hysterically. However, they could not air it because the stories were very not for 1940s standards, but they loved the laughter so much that Jack Mullen took out the laughter and saved them for later. And eventually, Bing Crosby was interviewing someone that was not as funny as Bob Burns. So instead of airing the weak response, like the weak laughter interview, they just used the laughter from Bob Burns' interview, and it went off without a hitch. And that's considered one of the first times when a laugh track was used. And Bing Crosby kept doing this. Other radio stations started doing this. And then eventually in 1953, we get the official creator of canned laughter, whose name is Charlie Douglas. He worked on sitcoms specifically, and he's credited with making the first laugh box, which is kind of like a soundboard, which had all like the major audience sound effects like ooh, ah, and of course, laugh. And Douglas used this to, quote, sweeten the response, which is kind of a way to say that he was telling the audience when to laugh. He was telling them what the joke is, when to laugh. When it's done, we can move on to the next joke. And this is interesting because it kind of tells the audience that this is your reaction to it. This is how you're supposed to react to this situation. And people laughed with the laugh track, even if it wasn't even funny. And this created kind of this cool psychological question of how much can our emotions be forced by external media? And so two psychologists by the name of Neuendorf and Fennel conducted some studies, and they noted that when you told a joke and added a laugh track to it, people laughed, even if the joke wasn't funny. The specific stuff is people expressed greater expressions of laughter or mirth. I don't know what that word is, but that's what the study says. But they don't find the joke funnier. It doesn't make the joke funnier. It just increases the expression of emotion, which I find fascinating. And then later, another psychologist by the name of Mendelssohn conducted further experiments on laugh tracks and jokes, and his studies kind of pointed that, one, if you're in a group of people, like an audience in a sitcom, you're more likely to laugh. Two, if you were able to laugh, if there's a laugh track playing, more people are going to laugh, like Neuendorf and Fennel noted. And three, his kind of hypothesis, somewhat of a theory, is that it showed that media itself can dictate emotions. It showed that the sound effect of laughing can reinforce the behavior that something is funny. It's kind of like how today a lot of films use music to express emotion, to convey the emotion and how the audience is supposed to feel, rather than actually making an emotionally compelling scene. But the effects of this has almost all sound effects kind of convey this thing. They're supposed to convey how you feel something. But canned laughter was able to take this to the next level and actually force a reaction and reinforce behaviors. Like if someone says a joke that's not really funny, they were able to get a laugh out of it and somewhat convince people that it was funny. And that's all I have to say. So take it away, Will.
Thank you, Andrew. That is all we have for you here today on the FX Effects podcast. We hope you'll come back and hear what we have to say next week.